Hey guys, Dark Skeleton here, and I'm back to finish my basic Hearthstone tutorial series, introducing all the basic decks to new players. And today I'm finishing it up with a level 10 version of each decks, and I'll be explaining which cards I put into the deck as you level up, and which cards you take out of the deck because they're simply subpar and you have better options now. So I'll be going through each class individually one by one down the list, and starting with Mage. So let's go ahead and get into it. Alright. So, for the Mage, first up, I took out one Arcane Explosion, because it is a rather weak AoE effect, and there aren't too many situations where it's going to be too powerful, though it does work pretty well with Cobalt Geomancer, which I left into the deck. I took out one Polymorph, not because Polymorph is a bad card, but because in a basic deck, no matter how many Polymorphs you put in, you're really not going to be able to compete with the very, very late game control decks that rely on a lot of legendary cards. Many of the strongest creatures in the game, also the highest mana cost and dangerous to have in a deck simply because you can't play them most of the time. Those kinds of cards, legendary dragons such as an Alexstrasza or Ysera or an Onyxia, are just too powerful for basic cards to take out. So you want to win before it goes to something like turn 15 or 20, where each player just has the luxury of playing huge cards like that. As such, taking one Polymorph out just assumes you're not going to be making it to that late of a game, and you want to just control the board through turn 1 and 10 before you get to that point. Though, if they do manage to get one big guy out, you still have a Polymorph for that. Next up, we took out one Gnomish Inventor. Gnomish Inventor is a very good card. The problem is that Arcane Intellect, I'd say, is slightly better in terms of its drawing power. Down here you can see it gives you 2 draw for 3 mana, and this was in the basic deck too. But considering this isn't a late game deck, there's only so much draw you're really going to need, and I felt that Arcane Intellect was the better choice. I also took out 2 Gurubashi Berserkers. Gurubashi Berserker does combo pretty well with Mage, but as I've explained a little bit in my other tutorial videos, it's a highly exploitable card. Any good player knows how much attack that Gurubashi Berserker is going to have after they do something, so they can just play around with it by sending a high HP, low attack minion into it initially to only take a couple points of damage, and then a really high attack but almost dead minion to finish it off. And then it's like, okay, you played the Gurubashi Berserker, it got to trigger its effect, but now it's dead, so it really didn't matter in the end too much. And I also took out one Stormwind Champion, the last one, not because it's a weak card, but because this deck isn't going to be playing too many minions. Mage tends to run a bit more spells, and we did add a couple new spells in. Simply because mage spells are very powerful, and I mean, it goes with the theme anyway of just being a mage. It's not a, I'm going to summon a horde of minions, it's, I'm going to fry your entire field. So in place of all those cards, we added in an extra dark scale healer. More and more as I was making the basic decks, I kind of realized that dark scale healer is just a really, really strong card. And if you have big 4-drops, which in this case the mage deck does have, Chillwind Yetis or Water Elementals, they hit the field on turn 4, and then when you're ready to play the dark scale healer on turn 5, they've taken some damage, but you can keep those fantastic cards alive with Dark Scale Healer, plus it heals your face. It's a great basic card, and I feel it belongs in the deck until a little bit longer when you get more commons and rares to put in. We also put in 2 Flame Strikes. Flame Strike is one of the new cards you get as you level up. I believe it's the level 10 card, and this card, as you can see down here, it deals 4 damage to all enemy minions. As long as the opponent's minions aren't huge like Boulderfist Ogres, this will just outright annihilate their field. And this is one of the best cards in Arena mode, but it's also very strong in Constructed as well. Okay, and we also have 2 Water Elementals. This is a new Mage minion, one of the best 4-drops in the game. It has a great stat lineup, 6 HP for 4 mana. It also has 3 attacks, so it's very good at killing weaker minions, but even if you run it up against a stronger minion, it has the special ability to freeze any character damaged by this minion. That's great at freezing something that's very dangerous on the board, possibly something like a Ventricle Mercenary, which has a huge drawback of while it's out, all other minions cost 3 more to play. It's just a very versatile card, great at controlling the field, and since it has so much HP, it's going to remain for a little while. Main weakness of it would be something like a Shadow Word Pain up against a Priest, because that destroys any minion with 3 or less attack, so watch out for that. And I believe that's it for the Mage, so next class. The Druid. Alright, for the Druid we had some major changes, especially with the later game minions, because in the previous deck, although we wanted a lot of late game minions, the basic cards are questionable at best. So we took out one War Golem. That's a very mediocre card. It has 7 attack, 7 health for 7 mana, and it doesn't do anything else, so it's not really that special. We took out 2 Stormwind Champions. Some of you might be kind of wondering about this, because I keep saying that Stormwind Champion is a great card, but it just doesn't belong in a Druid deck, because Druid plays a lot of big minions. For Frostwolf Warlord and Stormwind Champion, the more late game your deck is, the worse those cards actually are, and Druid is probably the definition of late game, in general. There are also other decks like Token Druid, which relies on just getting a bunch of tiny guys out, buffing them up, and finishing them up with something like a Savage Roar. We took 2 Gurubashi Berserkers out of this deck. I feel that Gurubashi Berserker belongs even less in a Druid than it does in a basic Mage deck, simply because the Druid has no way to trigger its effects. So moving on from that, we took out a Novice Engineer. There's still one remaining. It's a okay card. It's just not anything special. It lets you draw an extra card, which is great, but the problem is that it only has 1 attack and 1 HP beyond that, so 1 attack minion is not likely to really do that much, so you're just paying 2 mana to cycle a card. It's okay, it's not great, but there are better cards now. And in place of those cards, we put some fantastic Druid cards in. Ironbark Protector, not quite one of them, but it is a very strong card, especially for this point in your Hearthstone career. As you can see down here, it has 8 attack and 8 health, plus it has Taunt for 8 mana. This thing is huge, and against other newbie players, if you get late game as a Druid and you drop this on them, they're going to have a seriously hard time dealing with it. Its weaknesses would be any kind of major removal, something like a Polymorph, something like a Hex, or a bunch of minions running into it and then getting a Cult Master benefit where, although they traded 4 minions, they get to draw 4 cards, but that relies on a common card that can be pretty good in certain decks. But in general, it just walls out the entire field. Your opponent is going to have to trade so much to get into it and to get past it, and having 2 of those in the deck will really solidify your late game if you make it that far. Then we have 2 Swipes. Swipe is a card you'll see in almost every Druid deck. Oh, whoops. It's just so versatile because it does 4 damage to an enemy minion, or an enemy hero, any target you want, really. That's an enemy. But it also does 1 damage to all other enemies. So it's sort of like an Arcane Explosion, but you do an extra 3 damage to 1 targeted minion. And this is good because a lot of fields will end up having 1 big guy, but then a lot of other weak guys that only have 1 hit point. Especially if your opponent's playing something like a Sinjin Shieldmaster intentionally to protect their weak guys, something like Novice Engineers or Loot Hoarders, this thing will just wipe their entire field, and that's why it's played in all the Druid decks. It's so strong. Especially later on, if you get a card, it's a rare called Azure Drake, that will boost the damage to the main target to 5 and all other enemies to 2. So this card works great with spell damage. Next up we have a Chillwind Yeti. Alright, well that's already been in the deck, but just to go over it again, Chillwind Yeti is just solid in any deck because it has 4 attack, 5 health, and it just trades well with other minions, so you won't really feel bad putting that in a basic deck. But the card that we actually added into the deck this time was Starfire. This is a 6 mana spell. It's good at killing really big things. It deals 5 damage to any target, and you can also use it as a finisher if you need to. That I have seen done sometimes, and it works pretty effectively. But in addition to dealing 5 damage, it also allows you to draw a card. This kind of makes up for the fact that you're missing a Novice Engineer in the deck now. It's pretty strong. It's just you have to get into the later game before you can play it. So it's a good late game card, but holding it onto your hand, it'll be a little bit of a dead card until you get to that late game. But if you do get to the late game, it's great. It does a ton of damage, and it draws you a card. Next up, we have Savage Roar. This is another card that's played in many Druid decks, often in conjunction with Force of Nature, which is an epic card that summons 3 2/2 charge minions that can immediately attack, and then you Savage Roar on top of that to make them all have 4 attack. But this card is good in general if you have any amount of minions on the field. So if you're playing things like Razorfin Hunter, and then your opponent plays a bunch of big stuff that's walling the field, and your stuff's just not going to trade into it well, you can just Savage Roar, clear the field, or deal a ton of damage to your opponent's face. Having Savage Roar in the hand just means anytime you need the extra boosted damage, you have it, as long as you have extra minions on the field. This card is especially key to token decks, because tokens rely on having a bunch of tiny, weak minions that you get for free, then you buff them up with Savage Roar to finish your opponent off. And that's it for Druid. Mostly just taking away the crappy big minions and adding in better late game cards. It makes the deck a lot more solid. Okay, next up we have Priest. As I've mentioned before, this is one of my favorite classes. I like to play it a lot. I think I have it at level 37 or so right now, but we took out some late game. Some cards that actually might be kind of wondering about, but I'll explain it. So first off, we got rid of Stormwind Champion. Similar to the Druid, it just doesn't belong in a deck which doesn't play many early game minions and relies more on spells. Because when you do get to play it, at most, you'll likely only be able to buff 1 or 2 minions, and if you only have 1 or 2 minions to buff with Stormwind Champion, it's kind of mediocre. And if you don't have any minions at all because you're actually losing the game, then Stormwind Champion is actually quite bad. So we took that out of the deck. In addition, we took one Chillwind Yeti out of the deck, not because it's a bad card, it's a great card, as I was mentioning before. It's just, I slightly favor Sinjin's Shieldmaster and Priest for 2 reasons. 1, it protects your other minions, and 2, as a Priest, many enemy classes are going to want to rush you down. Going late game against a Priest is not very favorable for many matchups, so having Sinjin's Shieldmaster means they have to go through that first to get to you. Whereas Chillwind Yeti can just be ignored by your opponent, even though it has an extra attack. It's a really hard call. It's just slight preference to Sinjin's Shieldmaster, but you would be right to take a Sinjin's Shieldmaster and put a Yeti in place instead as well. And we took out Bloodfin Raptor, one of them. We left another one in just because you want to have something to play on turn 2, but we took the other one out because it's a pretty bad minion. And Acidic Swampy stays in just because it has the Battlecry effect over the Bloodfin Raptor. There is no beast synergy for Priest, so that card's gone. We took out 2 Voodoo Doctors. Priest in general has a ton of healing already, and especially with the new addition of Holy Nova, which we'll get to in a second, you already have tons of healing, and Voodoo Doctor is a dead card on turn 1 because you have no targets for its Battlecry. So I just feel with Holy Nova, there's really no need for it anymore. Plus, you got Darkskull healing. You have plenty of extra healing, so you don't really want to waste your cards on tiny one-drop minions that are not really going to do too much. So those are gone. We also took out 1 Elven Archer. I slightly favor Elven Archer even in this deck too, the Voodoo Doctor, but we left 1 in because having that extra 1 point of damage is nice. And if you do have to respond to your opponent playing a 1-drop, and then you go second, you play the Elven Archer to kill it, that can be pretty good situationally. Or if they coin into something like a Loot Hoarder, you have that to ping out the Loot Hoarder and get a minion on the field. As for cards we added, what I kind of prefer to do on turn 1 as a Priest would probably be to try something like Mind Vision. It's not actually a fantastic card, but if you have no other plays on turn 1, typically you don't want to throw out the Northshire Cleric, so you can just Mind Vision, and you can actually find out what your opponent is playing. I don't value it so much for the cycling a card. It does do that, and often your opponent will be holding on to their big cards, which means you might get something good like a swipe. But it allows you to figure out what your opponent's playing. If you know the cards in their hand, like you Mind Vision a Warrior, and then suddenly have an Alexstrasza in your hand, you know he's playing Control. It's a card that I would say is a little bit more useful as you go on, but eventually there are better cards to add into your deck anyway. It's an alright turn 1 play, and it's alright later game because later game they're going to be holding on to the big cards and you can Mind Vision to steal one from them. It's just, I like it because it lets you figure out what your opponent's playing, but it's not necessarily a hugely strong card. A common you can get later on called Thought Steal, which for 3 mana puts 2 random cards from your opponent's deck into your hand, without removing it from their deck. They put copies into your hand. That card is better than Mind Vision. Next up, we put 2 Shadow Word Deaths. This is the higher end version of the Shadow Word Pain. Shadow Word Pain removes any target that has 3 or less attack from the field, but the Shadow Word Death destroys any minion with 5 attack or more. This is basically the equivalent of a Mage's Polymorph or a Shaman's Hex. It does things a little differently. Death rattle effects will still trigger from this, So I'd say it's very good. I'd say Hex is better from a Shaman. But having two of these in the deck is very good, especially if it goes late game. Your opponent will be playing a bunch of huge minions. A lot of minions late game do have 5 attack or more, so Shadow Word Death has a lot more targets than something like a big game Hunter, which is an epic minion that when you summon it can destroy any minion with 7 or more. But the thing is, in the meta right now, not many people actually play that many minions that have 7 or more attack. Like a Paladin will be playing Tyrion, which is the Paladin legendary. It's a 6/6 with Divine Shield and the Death Rattle that gives the Paladin a 5/3 sword. It is probably one of the best legendaries in the game, but it doesn't have 8 or more, 7 or more attacks, so you can't target it with Big Game Hunter. And it just tends to be that way. There's also Sylvanas Windrunner, which is a 5 attack, 5 health minion. When it dies, it steals a random minion from your opponent's side of the field, but you can't target that with Big Game Hunter. Shadow Word Death can. And you probably don't want a Shadow Word Death of Sylvanas, by the way, unless you have an empty field, because you'll be losing a minion. But it's a very good removal card. There are a lot of targets for it. If your opponent... Really, I think just about every deck has something that's 5 attack or more. Even Zoo plays Doom Guards, which have 5 attack and 7 health, and this can target that. So it's very good to have at least one of them in the deck, just to destroy deadly minions before they destroy you. And we have 2 Holy Novas. This is a card that goes in many priest decks. It's very solid, especially if you have big minions on the field, and this goes great with something like Chowind Yati Ascension Shieldmaster for the same reason Darkscale Healer does. For 5 mana, it deals 2 damage to all enemies, including the enemy hero, and restores 2 health to all friendly characters, including you and all of your minions. This card is just the priest board clear, and also, if your minions are still alive, hopefully they are, then it reestablishes your board presence and makes your opponent have to deal with it all over again. It's a very strong card, and at least one belongs in almost any priest deck, but almost all of them do run 2. I keep the Darkscale Healers in the deck for the same reason I keep them in many of the decks, because it is a value card. It restores 2 health to all friendly characters, and I feel that having them in the deck still is quite solid. It's basically a Yeti with the extra heal. But we also have Mind Control, which we added in. Just one of them. This card is super late game. If your opponent is one of the opponents who likes to play all of these crazy legendary cards that you don't have yet, you can just steal it from them. They play a Ysera. It's a 4/12 dragon that at the end of the turn draws a Dream card. Dream cards are crazy powerful. Then it's like, okay, so you played a Ysera. It's mine now. This card, late game, it can churn the tables in a single turn. The problem is, in many cases, until it gets to that super late game, it's a dead card, so you don't really want 2 of them unless you're certain that the rest of your hand is going to make up for it. But in a basic deck, you can't really guarantee that, so I'd only recommend 1, if any. It is powerful, it's just very situational. Alright, next 3 classes. Hunter. Alright, this class actually changed quite a bit. First off, we removed 2 River Crocolisks in favor of Acidic Swampoos. I think in the basic deck, the level 1 version, I probably should have made this change to begin with, because having 3 attack and 2 health with the ability to destroy an opponent's weapon is stronger than a 2 health, 3 attack, 2 attack, 3 health minion. Even though it has the Beast's synergy, the thing is, there are extra cards that you really need for Beast synergy, quote-unquote, to really work. Houndmaster does work with the River Crocolisk, and that it can make it a 4/5 taunt, but there's already plenty of other Beast targets in this deck for you to give taunt to, so I didn't really feel holding onto the River Crocolisk just for that reason was worth it. And in general, I did kind of decrease the Beast synergy. As you can see, we also removed a Timberwolf. The thing is, Timberwolf is really good when you have something called Unleash the Hounds, summons 1/1 charge tokens for every minion your opponent has on the board, and then you can Timberwolf to make them have 2 attack and 1 health. But you don't have that yet. If you have 2 Unleash the Hounds, then having 1 or 2 Timberwolves does become a lot better in the deck. But since we only have a handful of beasts, and it's pretty weak on its own without buffing other beasts up, I felt that, you know what, let's get rid of the crappy early game cards and put in a little bit more mid-game, late-game kind of stuff. we also removed 2 Iron Fur Grizzlies, and the reason for this is because as you level up as Hunter, you get Animal Companion, which is a spell that summons one of 3 different beast companions, and each of these 3 beasts are significantly better than the 3/3 Taunt Bear, the Iron Fur Grizzly, so we just replaced that outright with Animal Companions because it's a better card. We also removed a single Stormwind champion. The reason for this is that Hunter is not really a late game deck, and I guess what I'm kind of referring to with that is you're going to be trying to go to your opponent's face. Stormwind Champion and Frostwolf Warlord are good if you have a lot of early game minions. We did remove a couple of early game minions so that we could have a stronger late game here, or mid game. The thing is, those cards are just so situational. So I removed 1 Frostwolf Warlord and 1 Stormwind Champion, but I still leave a couple of those in because you might get into the situation where you do have 3 minions on the field and you can make Frostwolf Warlord or Stormwind Champion really work. The problem is, if you have 2 of each of those in your hand and you have nothing to play them off of, then they're dead cards. So we're going for some more consistency here. Also, yeah, we removed 1 Stormwind Tusk Boar, but I kind of already went over that. The reason is, the only reason Stormwind Tusk Boar would really be good is you play it and then you Houndmaster on the back of it. And that's fine. If you save a Storm Tusk Boar so that you can do that on turn 5, a 3/3 Charge Taunt Boar with a 4/3 Houndmaster on the field, that's a fine play. Just in general, ever since they nerfed Starving Buzzard, which used to be a 2-mana minion, where whenever you played a beast you could draw a card, it just hasn't been worth it to play Starving Buzzard. And that was the other card that Stone Tusk Boar really worked up well off of. Because for 1 mana you could just draw an extra card, and you'd still have 1/1 on the field, with charge. But it's a lot weaker ever since that, so leave it in the deck, just 1 of them, so that you can Houndmaster it, but in general it's just a pretty weak card. It does work with Timberwolf, though, so you can make a 2/1 charge for 1. Okay. We also threw in 2 kill commands. This card belongs in almost all Hunter decks, because Hunters want to kill your opponent, as all decks do, but Hunters especially, before it gets too late game. This card, as long as you have a beast on the field, it deals 5 damage for 3 mana, which is pretty mana efficient, but having this extra power goes really well with Hunter, because you can combine it with your hero power, then that's 7 damage on the field, or you use 2 commands in your hero power, that's 12 damage. So kill command allows you to burst your opponent down, and you can use it to remove enemy minions if you have to as well, because it deals 5 damage to any target on the field. It does less damage if you do not have a beast, though. That's one of the reasons we have to leave at least a handful of beasts in here. It only does 3 damage if you don't have a beast, which is significantly weaker. But you have a beast, you play this, it's good removal or a great finisher as well. Okay, 2 Gnomish Inventors. We added this to the deck so that you could be more of a mid-game deck. Hunter on its own, ever since Starving Buzzard got nerfed into the ground, really struggles with drawing power. So this card allows you to keep your hand going a little bit longer, and then as you move into the mid-game, you'll be alright, you'll be able to finish your opponent off, and you'll have the steam necessary to keep going. An alternative to Gnomish Inventor, if you get the common, is called Cult Master, which for 4 mana, it gives you a 4/2, where whenever one of your friendly minions dies, except for Cult Master, you get to draw a card. So if you have a field, and you're going up against a big minion, like an Ironbark Protector, you play Cult Master, you send your whole field into it, your minions all die, but you get extra cards for each one that died. I'd say Cult Master is better as drawing power than Gnomish Inventor is, especially if you combo it with something like a Snake Trap or Unleash the Hounds, cards that you'll get later on. But Gnomish Inventor will definitely do the job for now. And just to quickly go over it again, Acidic Swamp Ooze, I should have added this to the level 1 version of the deck, but having 2 Acidic Swamp Oozes, it'll be great versus other Hunters because it will destroy the Eagle Horn Bows, and it will be great versus Warriors, Shaman, and Rogue to destroy their equivalent weapons. So it's a very good card, and even though it's not a beast, I think it still belongs in this deck for the time being. Next up, we have the the Paladin, sorry. We took out 2 Stormwind Knights and both Stormwind Champions. The reason for this, Stormwind Knight, it's a 2 attack, 5 health charge minion, but the stats that you get for it are just not all that strong, and as you level up with Paladin, you get a lot of 4 power, really strong removal cards. So Stormwind Knight as something like an emergency, charge from the hand, kill a weak opponent minion so that you can reestablish a board. It's not really necessary anymore because Paladin as a class already does that pretty well. So we removed those. We also removed the Stormwind Champions. Although it does work really well with having a bunch of 1/1s on the board, Paladin is a class which is slow. And it's going to be hard to establish a board against an opponent who really wants to control your board, which would be generally a smart idea unless they're trying to rush you down. So we removed the Stormwind Champions just because they're too situational. You could consider leaving one in. It does work well with the hero power. I just feel it's too situational. We removed one Light's Justice, and this is one because having 2 Light's Justices is a little bit overkill in the deck. It was just the best of the crap you have at level 1. But secondly, because now that we're level 10, we can add in 2 true silver champions, which are fantastic weapons and much better than Light's Justice. We leave one in because in the early game it can kill a few weak minions, and that's pretty good for Paladin because they don't have a lot of easy, real cheap removal, but swinging at things for 1 damage with Light's Justice can do that for you. We also removed 1 Blessing of Might and 1 Hand of Protection. They're okay cards, they're kind of situational, but overall they really belong in more aggressive decks. And there's just really not that much from Paladin to be aggressive without things like pre-nerf Leroy Jenkins or Faceless Manipulator. So I didn't really feel those belonged in the deck. I kind of wanted to keep 2 Hands of Protection because you can use it to run things into other things, and then you Hand of Protection before that happens to keep them from taking any damage. But it's situational to make it really that valuable of a card. And in place of all those, we have some fantastic cards. As I mentioned before, the True Silver Champion. This thing deals 4 damage per attack, has 2 durability, so that means 2 attacks. Plus, whenever your hero attacks, you restore 2 health to your hero. So this means you can basically take out minions up to something that has 4 health, which is a great number to deal damage for. And when you take damage from them, well, actually the effect triggers before you take the damage, but you basically heal all the damage you're going to take. So it's basically remove 2 minions for free, and that's just fantastic. Especially since you can remove such strong stuff with 4 damage. Also, we have 2 Blessings of Kings. This card can go really, really well with those 1/1 tokens your hero power makes. So you make a 1/1 token, and then as you get to turn 4, if that token's still out there, you can make it a 5/5, which allows you to kill enemy minions unexpectedly, or you can also just use it to ram your opponent's face in. This card also goes well if you get the common Scarlet Crusader, I believe it's called. It's a 3/1 with Divine Shield, but this card would make it a 7/5 with Divine Shield. So there are cards that can really combo well with Blessing of Kings, but it's great just to use on a token in general. It's a pretty powerful card. We also have 2 Consecrations. I think the last time I checked, this was in something like 88% of all Paladin decks. It is the Paladin's AoE removal spell. It deals 2 damage to all enemies, including the enemy hero. It does scale with spell damage, but it's very good removal. It only costs 4 mana. It's less powerful than Flame Strike, but it also hits the enemy hero, and also costs a lot less mana. It's a very, very solid card, and belongs in most, if not almost all, Paladin decks. And we have 1 Guardian of Kings. This is partially replacing the Stormwind Champion. The reason for including this in the deck, as well as the 2 Holy Lights up here, is that as Paladin, you're one of the slowest classes in the game, right up there with Priest. So many classes like Hunters, Aggressive Warriors, or Aggro Rogues are going to be trying to rush you down. If you can make it to turn 7, you use Guardian of Kings, you heal yourself back up, and you throw a big guy on the field with 5 attack and 6 health. Your opponent will think that they have you in many cases when they actually don't as a Paladin, because with Holy Light, Guardian of Kings, and well, actually Darkscale Healer as well, you have so much healing potential. You can be a very defensive class, and most Paladins do play that way. So as a turn 7 drop, this thing is almost guaranteed to actually heal your hero up. As long as your opponent isn't too passive, this card can be very strong and save your ass. So you could kind of think of it as a 5 mana, 5/6, with the added ability of having an extra Holy Light without spending a card. It's pretty solid. Next up, we have Warlock. Previously, there were a bunch of Warlock cards I really hated to have to put in because they actually suck. One of those being Succubus. It's a 4/3 for 2 mana, but the problem is you have to discard a card whenever you play it, and when you match it up against many other 2-drops, they're going to have 3 attack anyway, so they're just going to 1-for-1 trade, plus you lose a card, which is bad for you. So that one Succubus I had to put in, that thing's gone. I also took out one Murloc Tidehunter. As you can see here, it's a 2/1 that summons a 1/1 Murloc Scout. Not a terrible card, but in general, there's just better cards to put in now, and I didn't really feel it was that valuable to include it. So that's gone. Okay, Hellfire, that's still in the deck. Hellfire is a oh shit removal card. It kills all your own stuff too, so you want to use it when your opponent is overwhelming you with the board. You only have 1 or 0 guys left, and you just have to reset it. That can happen as Zoo when all things go to hell. But what we did remove was 2 Drain Life spells. Drain Life, for 3 mana, you deal 2 damage and you heal 2 HP to your hero. The problem with that card is that it's very, very, very slow. And in slow Warlock decks, which would generally be your handlock deck, there's much better removal cards to put in, such as a Siphon Soul. But in this deck, which is more along the Zoo side of things, where you're trying to play a bunch of weak minions and overwhelm your opponent's board, Drain Life was way too slow for that, so both of those are gone. We also removed 1 Raid Leader, which is generally a very mediocre card. The only reason it's in this Warlock deck to begin with is that as a Zoo quote-unquote Warlock, you're trying to play a ton of minions, and this thing does do alright with a ton of minions. If you have 3 minions on the board, and you give them all +1 attack, then Raid Leader's alright in that situation. It's just a very situational card, so it's not too good, because even with the bonus effects, it's only slightly better than something like a Direwolf Alpha, if better at all, even, because it does cost an extra mana. In general, it's not better, it's actually worse, though. Okay. Cards we added in. 2 Soulfires. This card belongs in every Warlock deck. 99% of Warlock decks. The only one I could imagine you wouldn't want to use it in is if you need every single card to win. But this card gets you huge tempo swings. You discard a random card. It deals 4 damage to any target. It can be an enemy hero if you want, so it can be used as a finisher. But the thing that makes it so amazing is that it costs 0 mana. So this means on a turn where you do a bunch of other stuff, you can also deal 4 damage, take out a huge enemy minion, and just swing the tide of the board around. And that's what Zoo does best. It's about controlling the board, overwhelming your opponent. And Soulfire is a card that overwhelms stuff. Discarding a card isn't too bad for Warlock, because as you get into the later game, you can always life tap to draw an extra card each turn. And using life tap like that is something Zoo does a lot. Okay, we also added in 1 Dread Inferno. This card, I think, was slightly on the more questionable side of things. It's a good card in that it has pretty decent stats, and the battle cry can be used to kind of AoE your opponent's side of the board, but it has the same problem that Hellfire does, that it damages your own cards. I think it's alright in the deck. It's situational when you want to play it. As you get into the later game, it can be used if you kill 1 or 2 of your enemy's dudes, then it's kind of worth playing. A card that makes Dread Inferno a lot better, if you do go into Naxxramas and unlock the Warlock card from that, Voidcaller, whenever it dies, it summons a random demon from your hand without using the Battlecry effect, so if your Voidcaller dies, you can get a Dread Inferno onto the field. I just felt it was kind of makes your deck a little bit more mid-game, and it's one of the better 5 or 6 drops that you can get outside of the very rare or legendary cards. It won't stay in your deck forever, though, I can guarantee that. We also added in 2 Mortal Coils. This card is run in some Zoo decks and some Handlock decks. It's semi-situational. It deals 1 damage to an enemy minion, and you only want to use this to kill enemy minions, because if it does kill, it helps you draw a card for free. And it only costs 1 mana, so this thing can get rid of really annoying cards. It's sort of like playing an Elven Archer, just a little bit different. I'd say in the best Zoo decks in the world, you probably wouldn't run Mortal Coil, but it is a solid card. It can be used as removal, and sometimes drawing that extra card is nice for extra tempo. It's just, you have to hold on to it until you can play it. The thing is, typically, there's going to be an enemy minion that ends up hitting 1 HP sooner or later, so it's not that situational. It's an alright card. So I think it belongs in here a lot more than the Succubus or Murloc Tidehunter or Raid Leader does. Alright, last three classes. Next up, we have the Rogue. This is the class that actually had the least changes, kind of surprisingly. And what we took out was one Assassinate. As I explained in the previous level 1 Rogue video, Assassinate is a card which destroys an enemy minion, but it's removal, but the problem is it has a higher mana cost than other removal like Polymorph or Hex. And another problem with it is that it actually destroys your opponent's minion instead of turning it into something else, which is a problem in a game that has a lot of Death Rattle cards. Death Rattle is something that's very prevalent in the metagame right now. People are playing minions that, when they die, they summon another dude or a couple of spiders or a tiny slime. And when you destroy it with Assassinate, you only destroy the main guy. Something still comes back. So for 5 mana, you're not even really killing it. You're just making it turn into something else. It is a decent spell for killing big things like Ysera or an Alexstrasza. The thing is, though, really late game cards aren't actually getting used that much, I kind of noticed. The biggest things that are really being run recently, I've seen Kel'Thuzad, which is a card you get at the end of Naxxramas. The Tyrion, Paladin's legendary, but if you kill Paladin, if you kill a Tyrion with Assassinate, they still get the 5/3, what's it called? I can't remember the name of the blade, but it has 5 attack and 3 durability. So for 5 mana, you're removing an 8 mana minion, but you're still giving your Paladin a huge card, a 5/3 blade, which he's definitely going to use to beat you into a pulp. There's just too many targets that even though you kill it outright, there's still going to be some nasty effect that happens, or they're already going to have done something with that card, like Ysera. At the end of the turn you play it, it's already drawn a dream card, so you're not even really one-for-oneing. You're using an Assassinate to take out the main body, but they've already done something with that major card. Even things like Baron Geddon has 7 attack, 5 health for 7 mana. At the end of the turn it comes out, it already deals 2 damage to everything on the field. So Assassinate is a card which is at best going to get like equal mana value most circumstances, and in many cases it's not even going to have a good target, so it barely belongs in the deck. It's just, if you are in the situation where you really need it, it's there for you. We also took out one Voodoo Doctor, the last one in this deck, and the reason for that is that Voodoo Doctor is in general a pretty weak card, and probably the weakest out of anything else in the deck. Not much can be said about it other than it's bad as a turn 1 play because there's nothing to heal. It's overshadowed by Darkscale Healer, which restores 2 health to all friendly characters and has much better stats than a Voodoo Doctor. It's a later game play, but Voodoo Doctor just doesn't have that many circumstances where it's really that good of a play, and even if you do, would you really rather have a Voodoo Doctor in your hand in the mid-game, or would you rather have something huge like a Chillwind Yeti? So, it's just one of the first cards that had to go. But what we do have to replace it is a fantastic card called Assassin's Blade. This thing for 5 mana gives you a 3 attack sword, or dagger rather, with 4 durability, meaning it can swing 4 times for 3 damage. And this card goes extremely well with something called Deadly Poison. Deadly Poison will make that Assassin's Blade 5 attack, or even, if you're really lucky, 7 attack. So being able to swing 4 times for 5 damage, you could use that to almost kill your opponent with the blade alone, or you could have a lot of removal for enemy minions. Assassin's Blade is great as, if the game keeps going on turn after turn and you can expend the HP to kill enemy minions, it's fantastic. If you have enough turns left to be able to keep swinging at your opponent to finish them off, this thing will put out a ton of damage. So it's a very good rogue card, and in almost anything except Miracle Rogue, it's run pretty commonly. So it's a great card. We also have one Fan of Knives. This card is okay. In general, you'd probably prefer Blade Flurry. I guess that's a little bit arguable, but I'd say that Blade Flurry is the better card, but that's a rare you get. And it also expends your weapon. But this thing, it does 1 damage to all enemy minions and draws a card on the back of it. the drawing a card is nice because in the worst circumstances, if you have nothing else to play on your turn, you can just spend 3 mana, play Fan of Knives, and draw an extra card. But ideally, it will hit at least 1 or 2 targets for 1 damage, killing an enemy minion, and also drawing you a card. If your opponent's playing something like Zoo, or a hunter with a ton of little weak guys, then Fan of Knives can be a lot better. Dealing 1 damage to enemy everything on the field, it makes it better than Arcane Explosion because it has the draw card power. It's an alright card. It's a hell of a lot better than Voodoo Doctor and Assassinate, though, I can tell you that. Alright, so last 2 classes here. Next up we have the Shaman. In this deck, we removed the Frost Shock and Ancestral Healing. The reason Frost Shock is gone is that it is a pretty mediocre card, and it's only situationally good. For 1 mana, you deal 1 damage to an enemy character, and you freeze it. You could use it to stop your opponent from swinging a weapon, or you can stop a big creature from being able to act. The thing is, there's only a handful of circumstances where it's really, really useful. And later on, you'll get a common called Earth Shock, which is a much better shock card. It deals 1 damage and silences a minion. But in general, Frost Shock, just as having that card in your hand, for what it does, it's kind of weak, even though it costs 1 mana. We also removed 1 Ancestral Healing, the only one that was in the deck, also because it's a very situational card. The best you can get out of Ancestral Healing in this deck would be something like, if your Boulder Fist Ogre hits the field, has killed a couple minions, and still happens to remain on the field even after that, then you can restore it to full health, give it Taunt. Boulder Fist Ogre with Taunt would be pretty baller, because, I mean, that thing is going to be tough to go through. But that's about the only situation where it's really all that good. And in other situations, it's kind of a dead card, and you'd rather have something better in your hand. We removed 1 Frostwolf Warlord from the deck, and 1 Stormwind Champion from the deck. The reason for this is that they're also situational cards. Stormwind Champion is pretty good, and Frostwolf Warlord can be good. What makes those good in the deck is that it has benefit with the Shaman totems. Whenever you summon a Shaman totem, it's a free minion on the field, and that can affect a Frostwolf Warlord or a Stormwind Champion. But having 2 of each in the deck is just playing too greedily. You're like assuming that you're going to actually have all the minions in the field for those cards to benefit. So I felt having 1 of each is a lot less greedy, but still allows you to get the potential in those circumstances where you do have a ton of minions on the field. We also removed a Bloodfin Raptor. The reason for this is it's just a mediocre card in general. As far as 2-drops go, though you don't really want to play this as a 2-drop, we also have Flame Tongue Totem in the deck now, which is a much better card. It allows you to give adjacent minions +2 attack, and even though you can only have 2 cards adjacent to it at one time, you can actually make more cards than that actually get affected by this in the same turn. If you make this card adjacent to something that you're going to trade into an opponent's minion, then, okay, that minion trades in and it dies, and then the next card over slides in. So because of Flame Tongue Totem, it's kind of important to watch your positioning as a Shaman, because you could take a board full of totems and use all of those totems in combination with Flame Tongue Totem in order to trade into your opponent's field with cards you got for free. It's a very good card, and in general there's just a ton of tricky applications you can use it for. So it belongs in almost every Shaman deck. The last card we took out was Wind Fury in favor of Wind Speaker, and the reason for this is that they both basically fill the same purpose. Wind Fury gives a friendly minion Wind Fury as a spell for 2 mana, but Wind Speaker is a 4 mana creature that does the same thing. And I felt that this was acceptable in the basic deck, because Wind Fury as a spell is better when you have crazy combinations where you need to use a lot of weak, in terms of mana cost, cards all in one turn. But in this deck, there's not too many things for you to combo. Really, what you'd be using Windspeaker for is, on one turn, you play a Fire Elemental, and then the next turn, you give it Wind Fury, and you'll have enough mana to be able to use the Windspeaker and still do whatever else you're typically going to have done. With the 2 extra mana anyway, so you might as well get a 3/3 minion on top of all that. So speaking of Fire Elemental, this is one of the best Shaman cards in the game, actually one of the best 6-drops in the game in general. The reason for this is that it has a Battle Cry which deals 3 damage to any target on the field. This thing can remove some very, very, very strong minions. 3 damage is just a ton. You cannot overstate that enough for free damage. And you get all this for 6 mana, plus it has the stats of 6 attack and 5 health, which is pretty good. So this thing's just a value house. It'll reestablish your board presence before it even hits the field, and then it throws something at your opponent that they have to respond to. Having 2 of these in the deck, it kind of solidifies your mid to late game, where Shaman tends to be pretty strong. And that's it for Shaman. So the addition of Fire Elemental and Flame Tongue Totem and the swap for Wind Fury out for Wind Speaker is going to make the Shaman deck a little bit better. And as for the last class, Warrior. This class is a class that can typically be played aggressively, but the thing is you need a very, very specific deck in order to effectively be aggressive. So we're electing for a little bit more on the control side of things, where to play an optimal control warrior, sure, you do need some specific late game cards as well. So this is more of a mid-game control. It should do pretty well against mini decks because you can kill enemy minions with weapons, of which we added a new one into the deck. So what we did remove was Heroic Strike. The reason for this is that it gives your hero 4 extra attack for this turn for 2 mana, which is pretty efficient damage-wise. The thing is, in this deck, you're going to be hitting enemy minions, and to spend 2 mana to deal 4 damage and also take 4 damage yourself is a little bit questionable. It works well with aggressive decks because with aggressive decks, you're swinging at your opponent's face, so you're not going to take extra retaliation damage by swinging at opponents' faces with the Heroic Strike. Even then, though, it's only an okay card. We also have 2 Voodoo Doctors being removed from the deck. The problem with Voodoo Doctor is it's terrible as a turn 1 play because you're using a Battle Cry on a field that has no targets for its bonus healing. And later game, there's just many better cards which you'd rather have in the hand to play onto the field. Darkscale Healer serves basically the same purpose, it just does it better anyway. So those are both gone. We removed Dragonling Mechanic from the deck. Although I felt this card was pretty cute in combination with the Warsong Commander, it's still a pretty bad card in general. And now that we have better cards, there's just no reason to keep it in the deck. We also removed a Stormwind Champion from the deck, the only one that was remaining. And the reason for this is that Warrior is not a deck that typically runs tons of minions, but it does try to control the board. A Warrior who runs tons of minions is opening himself up for AoE damage, and as a Warrior you typically run out of steam pretty easily if you try to overcommit to the board. So you want to play some minions which are tough or will get stronger like a Mage cards, but are going to stick around on the board. You want to have a huge threat to your opponent. You want to overwhelm them with force and also have your hero backing them up with the plethora of weapons that you bring to the table. Kind of similar to Rogue. So, Novice Engineer. That was the last card we took out from the deck. The reason for this is that as a 1/1 creature, even though you draw the card, it's still mediocre as a card. It used to be better when it had 2 HP. But instead of Novice Engineer, we have a Shield Blocker in the deck, which I believe is a better card, even for a more mid-rangey kind of deck, maybe even for aggressive decks, though I'm not totally certain about that. What it does is, for 3 mana, you gain 5 armor, which is the equivalent of healing yourself 5, though it's a little bit better than healing yourself for 5, because armor can go up to as much as you want, and as you get later warrior cards, there are actually a couple cards like Shield Slam, which benefit from having extra armor. But you can just think of it as, give yourself 5 more extra HP right now, and then draw an extra card on top of that. And I think that's a bit better than having a measly 1/1 on the board, which is just going to die instantly anyway. So other cards that we added into that deck. 2 Cleaves. This card is pretty good as early game removal, and can be used even late game in some circumstances. What this card does is, as long as your opponent has 2 enemy minions, you can play this. It deals 2 damage to 2 targets. Ideally, your opponent has 2 minions on the board and they both have 1 or 2 HP left. This will kill both of them. So it's pretty good as a board control removal card. It's just a little bit weaker than some other ones, and that it's completely random which ones get hit. But it's still pretty good. We also have 2 Corcoran Elites. I would consider this to be one of the best remaining charge characters in the game, because although it's a charge minion, which many charge minions have weak stats, This one actually has pretty decent stats. It has 4 attack and 3 health for 4 mana, which means this card can go running into something else, like a Gnomish Inventor, which only has 2 attack and 4 health, kill it outright, and then you still have a 4/1 on the board which your opponent has to annoyingly respond to. So this thing can be used to trade, get 2 for 1 basically, or 1 for 1.5 if they remove it with something like a Hero Power or an Elven Archer. But it's also good at hitting your opponent's face, because charge 4 mana, 4 damage to the face immediately, and then having a big minion on the board, it can put some pressure on. So it's a pretty versatile card, and it's solid in a warrior deck. So I do not see any reason not to include it. And lastly, we have the Arcanite Reaper. This is a pretty strong weapon. It deals 5 damage for 5 mana, but also has 2 durability. 2 swings from this will do 10 damage to your opponent's face if you choose to use it that way. But in a more control setting, which this is kind of a mid-rangey deck, you can also use this to remove pretty huge minions. This thing can destroy a Chillwind Yeti outright, which is pretty hard to do with 1 swing from most weapons. Or it could destroy a Singeant Shieldmaster, it could destroy a Darkscale Healer, and there's just so many things this thing can take out. And you're getting big minions for this thing. The weakness for it, I suppose, would be if your opponent is playing nothing but a bunch of weak, tiny minions and is just overwhelming your board, then that kind of becomes a problem. And in certain circumstances, you might just have to give up the board, and if your opponent's low enough on HP, you can try finishing them off with weapons. Though, I wouldn't recommend that in most circumstances. If you can use this to take out something like a Chillwind Yeti, I'd almost always recommend that. So there you have it, all 9 of the basic level 10 decks. I really hope that these help you out a bit as you're playing as new players. And if you have any comments about my decks or how they work out for you as you're trying to climb the ladder, please let me know in the comments section down below. If you want to see more Hearthstone content as time goes on the next few days, go ahead and subscribe, and I thank you all very much for watching.